the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Monday, July 13th, 2015. The powerhouse economies of the Global South have just launched a new bank. It's an alternative to the World Bank and IMF. We'll turn to Sameer Dossani about how the BRICS Bank could offer alternatives during crises like those in Greece. And the Union of Concerned Scientists has just released a damning new report on the depths of deception by fossil fuel companies on climate change. Plus, part of our series on the science of health will tackle ADHD and why diagnosis rates keep rising with my guest, Dr. Deborah Budding. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Greece and Germany have reportedly reached a compromise deal this morning on salvaging Greece's economy and Eurozone membership at great public expense. The deal is imperative for Greece to receive an emergency bailout loan from the European Central Bank. In the long term, Greece needs a package of more than 80 billion euros to keep it afloat. But the austerity measures that Greeks vehemently voted against are likely part of the deal, whose details are yet to emerge. Among the EU proposals are privatization of Greece's electrical grid and cuts to the pension program. The New York Times' Paul Krugman and others took to Twitter with the hashtag #ThisIsACoup's to criticize the deal. The agreement is not yet cemented, as Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras still needs to present it to his parliament for ratification. Well, Rahul, is this a coup?
No, it's not a coup. I mean, if you want figurative language that's accurate, you could say that the loan sharks of the EU decided that they would give Tsipras a deal, but they also had to break his legs. Or to put it another way, what's interesting about the deal is that they have, in setting terms, stopped treating Greece like a sovereign nation and treated it more like some sort of private entity that's looking for credit. That's why the privatization fund they're going to create it's 50 billion euros of public Greek assets as collateral. So this is not this is the kind of credit arrangement you might expect if you were a private profligate spender like Greece, but not what you'd expect as a sovereign nation. It happens all the time to countries in the global south. What's interesting and different about this is that Greece is part of Europe, and this is a severe damage to what people like to call the idea of Europe. It's also very likely to cause severe problems in Greek domestic politics. Tsipras is to ram this deal through. He's going to have to shred his own party and his own governing coalition. We can expect to see him, like Obama, depending mostly on the opposition to get the deal passed, and probably having to let go some of his cabinet members.
And we'll be covering the deal as it emerges in the next day or two. Speaking of deals that are nearing fruition, the U.S. and Iran may be announcing a nuclear agreement today after more than 2 weeks of negotiations in this latest round taking place in Vienna. The 2015 P5+1 talks are the latest in international negotiations that go as far back as 12 years. Chinese and European officials are eager to finalize the agreement, but U.S. and Iranian officials are acting more cautiously. A U.S. State Department official told press yesterday that major issues remain unresolved. Analyst Gareth Porter and others are suggesting that the unrelated issue of an arms embargo against Iran may be what is holding up a deal, as it relates to Iran's role in the fight against the Islamic State and Israel's strong objection to any deal. Well, Rahul, do you agree with Porter's analysis that this may be what's holding it up?
Well, I agree with Porter in terms of the specifics, but the larger thing that's going on is basically this. The Obama administration finally, for once, has decided to try to deal with Iran on the basis of common sense. If you can't force them, forcibly, dismantle their nuclear program, then the only thing to do is to deal with them as if they are a nation where you can make an agreement that where both sides extend trust. The problem is in American politics, if you act on the basis of common sense, you have to make constant concessions to stupidity and insanity, and that's what the Obama administration is trying to do, with the hope that they can sneak through a sensible agreement at some point, as long as there's enough nonsense sort of overlarded on it.
And finally, the world was stunned over the weekend when Mexico's top drug kingpin, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, engineered a stunning prison break. It was the second time that the world's richest drug trafficker had managed somehow to escape the clutches of Mexican authorities. Guzman's recapture last year was touted as a crowning achievement by President Enrique Peña Nieto. According to AP, Guzman escaped via a sophisticated mile-long tunnel with ventilation, lighting, and a motorcycle apparently used to move dirt. U.S. officials last year expressed interest in extraditing Guzman, but Peña Nieto's administration claimed confidence in prosecuting him. The escape is being seen as a major embarrassment for Mexico and could strain ties with the U.S. Rahul, isn't his escape also a clear indication of corruption within the Mexican criminal justice system? There's no way he could have escaped again without somebody from the inside aiding him.
Absolutely, and a lot of people from the inside. I mean, basically, drug kingpins escaping prison in Mexico or escaping consequences is like is their version of, in the United States, financiers escaping prosecution. To give them some credit, they have actually, in Mexico, they have actually, removed a number of powerful drug leaders, but that doesn't mean they've also removed the institutionalized corruption that has grown up over decades. Here, of course, we haven't even made the first step of taking out a handful of financiers in order to start addressing our sort of institutional corruption.
That's a very good point, and we hope to cover the story tomorrow. Thanks, as always, Rahul, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A two-day summit of the BRICS group took place last week in the obscure Russian city of Ufa. Heads of state of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is what BRICS stands for, met to discuss the formation of alternative international banking institutions, and in particular the new Development Bank, or NDB, the fiscal crisis in Greece, and Greece's dependence on the Eurozone and International Monetary Fund is another symptom of the dominance of Western capital and neoliberal policies worldwide. For far too many years, poor nations have turned to these institutions for loans and been forced to restructure their economies in favor of corporate interests in exchange. If the powerhouses of the global south, such as India and China, can offer an alternative fund, there is hope of challenging Western financial hegemony. Joining me to answer that question is Sameer Dossani. He's an advocacy coordinator of ActionAid International. He's been working on issues of debt, development, human rights, and the international financial institutions for over 10 years. He's former executive director of 50 Years is Enough, the U.S. Network for Global Economic Justice, and he's currently ActionAid's expert on the BRICS effort. Welcome to Uprising, Sameer.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, how much economic clout do the BRICS countries really have? I mean, when we think of India and China and Russia, among them, of course, they have enormous populations. But in terms of economic clout, the U.S. has remained supreme for a very long time. Do these countries, when they join forces, compare to the U.S.'s economic clout?
Yeah, the short answer is no, Sonali. The U.S. is still far and away the world's biggest economy, but China is number 2 now. And that's not insignificant. I mean, it overtook Japan about a year and a half ago, I believe, as being the second largest economy. So the way that the world used to work for many, many years after World War II, which is basically that you have 3 main trading blocks, the U.S. kind of functioning on its own, Europe, and then Japan, and some sort of smaller Asian partners around Japan as well, Korea being the notable one. That's no longer described sort of global trade or global economics. And the creation of the BRICS, which really came out of the mishandling of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis on the part of the G7 and the United States in particular. That's one indication that we can't think about the world as a unipolar world, as a world where the U.S. can call all the shots anymore.
So, how far along is this new development bank? Did it get officially launched? Is it open for business?
That's right. It's the ceremony in last week in Ufa, which is, as you say, a rather small Russian city. That has sort of officially, launched the bank, as it were. It has a Shanghai address, but it will not start making loans until the end of the year, we are told. And the loans that we'll be making, we should keep in mind, it's going to have a relatively small portfolio compared to the World Bank, certainly, but even compared to institutions within the BRICS countries. BNDES, which is the Brazilian National Development Bank, lends more money every year than the World Bank does. And China has two institutions, the China Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank, each of which are bigger than the World Bank. So it's not going to be even as big as some of the institutions within BRICS-owned countries at this time.
It seems to me that a big challenge in even getting to where this group of countries has gotten to is simply coming to agreement. These are very different countries with very different agendas, and they have been working on this effort for a long time. Is reconciling differences a major part of what has taken so long?
Absolutely. I mean, at least. I mean, here I think we have to distinguish between what we know and what we. Well, there's two things: what we know officially, what we know through sort of unofficial channels and leaks and so on, or confidential discussions, and what we're speculating on. So according to what I've heard from Brazilian officials who would prefer not to be named, there have been some real differences of opinion with, I think, Brazil and South Africa taking what could be described as a more sort of democratic approach. For example, on voting share, these countries were really insisting that, Brazil especially was insisting that even smaller countries like South Africa should have equal voting power, even if they don't put in an equal amount of money into the institution. Whereas China and Russia were kind of saying, well, hey, let's just work on the same principle of the World Bank, which is sort of you have as many votes as you put in money to like a board of directors. And I think that Brazil lost that argument. So that's one example, but there are many examples of just things moving slower than they might be expected, because it's so difficult to reach consensus between very different kinds of economies and kinds of political economies within the countries.
Sameer, has this new development bank been explicitly formed with the goal of providing an alternative to these Western financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank? And if so, is the goal to do things differently or simply have a different source of funds?
Yeah, we know that these institutions were sort of posited. Were the idea for these institutions came because reform at the World Bank and the IMF and the UN Security Council was so slow, and these countries wanted to say, "Sorry, these are the promised reforms." So when these countries bailed out the banks, they were a big part of the bank bailout in the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. They only gave the money. These were mostly Western banks, European and American banks. They only gave the money, which they gave through the IMF, on the condition that there would be reform of those institutions, that they would have a bigger share. And indeed, there was some reform, but not nearly enough. So when they saw that things were going too slowly, they said, okay, we'll make our own mechanisms. This NDB, New Development Bank, is meant to be a new kind of World Bank. There is a CRA, the Contingency Reserve Agreement, that is the alternative IMF. Yes, they are theoretically meant to offer some kind of alternatives, but the signals are mixed. For example, the CRA, the alternative IMF program, which is there to deal with sort of short-term crisis issues and so on, which is an important role that the IMF could play. But the IMF only plays that role when countries agree to their harmful austerity conditions, when they agree to privatization and so on. Now, what the CRA has done is said, okay, up until 30%, so every country has a limit of what they can draw. You can draw 30% of your limit from that account. There won't be any conditions. But beyond that, it's not that we will have our own conditions, which could be debatable. Beyond 30%, you will need to have an agreement with the IMF. It means you will have to adhere to the IMF's conditions. Now, that's clearly not an alternative. So that's a bit unfortunate.
Now, I understand that your organization, ActionAid, among others, signed onto a letter asking the NDB to adhere to some basic principles. Can you tell us what those are?
Sure. I mean, I think the first principle that we can talk about is that, like doctors, development banks should first do no harm. We see a lot of World Bank and Asian Development Bank projects and so on that go in and just displace thousands of people. Those people lose their livelihoods. It's much, if not part of their lives, their life expectancy may be expected to go down. They lose access to services. They lose access to government provisions and so on. So we said, look, you need to have some kind of standards in place. You need to have some kind of safeguards, and you also need to have some kind of accountability mechanism so that communities that feel like they've been adversely impacted can take you to court through some kind of mechanism, whether it's a court inside the NDB or through national mechanisms or through an international human rights court. There needs to be some kind of redress. The second thing is that, when we talk about development banks and sort of development overall, unfortunately has largely not been about development. It's largely about keeping countries where they are in the development process. So if we look, for example, at a country, even countries that have done fairly well, take Brazil as a developing country that's done extremely well in some ways. Brazil still, despite all of its successes, is still an economy that's largely dependent on commodities: gas, oil, sugarcane, soy, a few others. That's not different from what Brazil was during the colonial period. Brazil was a huge source of sugarcane, rum during the colonial period. It was a huge source of other sorts of commodities and so on, cocoa, coffee, and so on. So when we're sort of progressing from a colonial or chronically underdeveloped society to an industrial society and now we need to be talking about sort of post-industrial or different kind of industrialization based on what I call the solidarity economy. We know we need to sort of be moving up this ladder, and we know how countries can move up the ladder, but unfortunately the World Bank and the IMF have ensured that countries cannot move up that ladder. So the second principle when we talk about a new kind of development or a new kind of development bank should be that it's about actual development and not chronic underdevelopment.
Now, I know that Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras was scheduled to go to Ufa to meet with the BRICS leaders on Friday. Did that happen? Russian President Vladimir Putin said he has not asked for loans from the BRICS banks. Can you give us an update?
No, I do not believe that Tsipras made it to Greece. That was to Russia. That was an interesting offer, and it's something that I think Greece would be wise to explore, and other countries would be wise to explore. But Greece, especially given what we're hearing, the details of the agreement that's been reached over the weekend, it just seems so implausible that Greece will be able to adhere to these conditions. They're going to have to start looking for ways out, and maybe some kind of alliance with the BRICS, some kind of loan mechanisms. Maybe that could be part of it.
And couldn't, at least in the future, once the NDB gets fully off the ground, couldn't countries like Greece that are experiencing these kinds of crises potentially use just even the existence of the new development bank as leverage against the IMF and the World Bank? Because for too long, it's been, at least financially and economically, a unipolar world for struggling nations.
Yes, that's true. I think Greece is just in a very, very strange situation, given the role of the euro in that situation. But absolutely, I mean, the more, even if this new development bank was just going to be another World Bank, in some ways it's better to have another bank with different owners and different controls, because you can use it does increase the bargaining power of small countries. You're not dependent on only the IMF or for the green light, for example. So what the IMF does, the IMF will give a very small loan to countries, but by giving that small loan, or by giving giving even a letter saying that this country is in good standing with the IMF, what it's doing is it's sending signals to world markets that this country is okay to lend to. And what China has done from time to time, and we hope they continue to do, and maybe the new development bank will do as well, is ignore that, is lend to countries that may not be in good standing with the IMF. So that sometimes creates a helpful leverage point for countries that can say, hey, we don't need money, we don't need to adhere to these conditions, we have a way out, and that way out is to rely on some kind of arrangement with other developing countries, including China.
What about the role that the NDB can potentially play in places like Africa and Latin America, where there are so many countries that have fallen prey to the World Bank and IMF structural adjustment programs, particularly in Africa?
No, absolutely. It could be. I mean, again, we're talking about a small amount of money right now.
Yeah.
We're talking about, they have gone out of their way to say they will cooperate with the existing financial institutions. They will not compete with them and so on. But yeah, in the long run, this could be something really interesting for developing countries. If you go back, I'm sure some of your listeners would be familiar with the Bandung Conference of 1955. So this was an era where the colonial era was sort of coming to an end. Many African countries who attended were not even fully independent. They were in the process of gaining independence from their colonial masters. And what this conference did was it talked about a number of things, politics and so on being a key one. But part of the discussion was, we cannot rely on Europe. We cannot rely on the United States to help us in our development process. We need to rely on each other. We need to rely on South-South solidarity. We need to rely even on bigger countries. This is explicitly said. We need to rely on the bigger countries to develop first, and then to be the locomotive of development that will take the smaller countries along with us. And so, we had the massive complications related to the Cold War that kind of put that whole project on the sidelines. But I think now we're at a stage where we can talk about, okay, what does it look like for countries that are still suffering all these years later, still suffering some of the after effects of colonial economics? How do we get together, how do citizens of those countries get together and form new economic models based on principles of solidarity as opposed to based on principles of exploitation?
Finally, Sameer, and very briefly, the fact that the heads of state from these 5 countries, very large countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, met in Russia last week and got so little media coverage in the US, is an indication perhaps of the fact that it doesn't seem to be very much on the Western media's radar, certainly, and possibly even the political establishment's radar. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the political establishment is keeping its eyes open. I think they're wary of the G7, of the G20, excuse me, which all the BRICS countries are members of the G20, and they're wary of the role that the BRICS can play within that bloc. So I know that leaders in the US and Europe are keeping their eyes open to this. In the case of the media, yeah, I think it's something that Western and American and US news media doesn't really understand that well. Let's see if they take the trouble to educate themselves a bit more.
Sameer, thank you so much for joining us today and shedding light on this issue.
Thank you.
My guest, Sameer Dossani, is an advocacy coordinator of Action Aid International, and he is the former executive director of the 50 Years is Enough U.S. Network for Global Economic Justice. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. When Pope Francis used his bully pulpit to speak out about climate change, conservative deniers were quick to dismiss him. U.S. Senator James Inhofe, a prominent climate denier, said the Pope ought to stay with his job and we'll stay with ours. Inhofe's job has literally been to spread disinformation about what causes climate change so that it stymies action against the fossil fuel industry. Now, the Union of Concerned Scientists has released a damning report on how fossil fuel companies for years have known the risks of climate change and worked actively to deceive the public. The report, entitled The Climate Deception Dossiers, is a collection of secret documents and memos over a 27-year period from companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, ConocoPhillips, Shell, and more. They were obtained from a variety of Freedom of Information Act requests, lawsuits, and whistleblower leaks. The 85 memos, numbering a total of 330 pages, have been made available online for public view. They reveal that fossil fuel companies actively spread disinformation about climate change and that such deception continues today. My guest is Nancy Cole. She is the Director of Campaigns for Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's also one of the authors of the report Climate Deception Dossiers. Welcome to Uprising, Nancy.
Thank you.
Now, we've known for years that fossil fuel companies have funded scientists, and I put the word scientists in quotes, to add to the uncertainty of climate science. And all they needed to do was sow doubt, and they succeeded. What do these documents show about that specific strategy and how explicitly that strategy was laid out?
Yes, there are 2 of the 7 dossiers in this report that actually speak to that exact point. And of course, it might be helpful to remember that the fossil fuel companies are basically playing off of the same playbook as the tobacco industry and other industries that have sought to deny and deceive the public about the harm of their products. So we have a memo from the American Petroleum Institute in the late 90s. API is the sort of trade association that all of the big oil and gas companies belong to. And we also have a memo from a coalition of coal companies, including Peabody Energy, which is one of the biggest coal companies in the US, that explicitly say in those memos that they're seeking to sow doubt that victory will be achieved when the public believes there are uncertainty in the science, or when climate change is believed by the public to be theory, not fact. So we have some really good evidence in these dossiers of exactly that strategy.
And let me actually quote directly from the memo you were mentioning, a 1998 memo from the American Petroleum Institute. Victory will be achieved when average citizens, quote, understand, in brackets, recognize uncertainties in climate science. Recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the, quote, conventional wisdom. So they didn't beat around the bush. Where did this strategy come from, by the way? Is this something that was just sort of invented, or does it harken back to, say, for example, how tobacco companies approached their campaigns?
Absolutely. There's a direct connection back to the tobacco campaign of lies and deception. It worked, that campaign, the tobacco campaign, worked pretty successfully for a number of years, decades really. And so I think other industries have used that same playbook. But there's just they don't have to win. They don't have to. They just need to sow doubt. They just need to make uncertainty their product. And so then that makes it harder for the public to rally around the solutions that we should have been working on for decades. And it gives policymakers an excuse for not taking action. So it's a very deceptive practice that has been going on for decades.
Let's turn to another internal memo. In 1991, a leaked internal strategy memo from the Information Council on the Environment, which is a front group for coal interests, under strategies, their memo said, reposition global warming as theory, in brackets, not fact. Tell us about the demographic groups that this memo thought it would be good to target, Nancy. Older, less educated males and younger, lower income women were spelled out as being sort of prime demographics for targeting with the strategy.
Yes, I think what that really shows is just how deliberate the coal and gas and oil companies have been in the use of these strategies. They really did their demographic homework, if you will, their messaging, their public messaging homework, and really zeroed in on places where, on particular groups of people that they thought would be most receptive or susceptible, if you will, to their message. So, but the main point to me is that just the deliberateness of it, the actual They knew they had a product that was harming people. They knew that decades ago. In fact, the email that we uncovered from a former Exxon employee suggests that that Exxon was thinking about the dangers of carbon dioxide, which is the main heat trapping gas that causes global warming, way back in 1981,
Right.
and probably before that. And yet, for the next more than 30 years, these companies banded together and sought purposely to deceive the public and our policymakers and to undermine the potential for action to reduce emissions.
And they specifically said these are the internal scientists working for Mobil at the time before it merged with Exxon to be ExxonMobil, that this climate science cannot be denied. Those are actual quotes, that the science cannot be denied. So let's put it together. These companies knew this was real, knew that climate change was happening, that it cannot be denied, and then specifically and very deliberately laid out a strategy on how to prevent that knowledge from being cemented in the public consciousness, because of course when that happens, we know that people want to take action about their planet being destroyed. Now, how specifically at that time, how much of public acceptance was there about climate science? In the media, your report shows a 1988 New York Times article, just so that we know what the before and after effect of the strategy was. So at the time, before the strategy was fully implemented, was it fairly well accepted in the media that climate change was a reality?
I think it's pretty clear that both scientists and policymakers knew for a long time, even before 1988, that the potential of overloading the atmosphere with too much CO2 would cause damage, would cause global average temperatures to increase, and that likely would have an array of impacts around the world. The reason why we chose 1988 was because by that time, there was very highly publicized testimony in Congress, which you just mentioned, front page news in the New York Times. Scientists were speaking out much more clearly and forcefully. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had been established to help advise governments on the threat and scope of this problem. The EPA was already looking at it. We knew that, there just wasn't any doubt that definitely by 1988, these huge companies that had big scientific staff, large numbers of scientists on their staff, not to mention PR people, knew or should have known that this was a real threat. And in fact, the email from the ExxonMobil scientists basically shows that, in fact, they did know that they were factoring CO2 emissions and the threat of climate change into their internal business decisions 7 years even before it hit the press. So, the decades of deception, it's just very clear.
It's very clear. Now, they went pretty far in sowing doubt. It wasn't just let's get folks to question this, but at one point in 2009, so not that long ago, I understand a PR firm working for these companies actually sent a letter to Congress, or letters to Congress from nonprofit groups that had been forged. They forged letters from groups like the NAACP. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So the bigger context for the importance of this story, I think, is that this example that you just cited, is that the fossil fuel companies sort of ramp up every time there is the possibility for some kind of legislation or policy being put into place that would begin to reduce carbon emissions from industry in this country. So they had a very deliberate plan to wrap up every time they felt threatened, right? So the context for the story that you just told about these forged letters was that they actually happened right before a big vote in the US Congress on a bill that would have begun to reduce carbon emissions in the US. Many of your listeners may know this as the Waxman-Markey bill. It was the first big federal effort to curb carbon emissions. And so they just pulled out all the stops. And the particular example that you described was from a consortium of coal companies. You know, so much of US electricity is generated by coal. It's one of the biggest sources of emissions, carbon emissions in this country is from coal-fired power plants. And they did everything they could to stop this bill from passing. And, you know, the evidence suggests in this dossier that both the PR company and the association that the PR company worked for knew that these letters were forged before the vote was taken, but didn't tell any Congress people who received these forged letters that they were actually fake until after the vote, and that vote was lost. And we to this day have no comprehensive policy in this country that reduces carbon emissions.
Now, your report also singles out the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which is a group that brings together corporate executives and state lawmakers to affect state by state policy and legislation, and generally tilted extremely rightward. What role has ALEC played in working with these companies to stymie state level efforts? You just pointed out a federal level effort being stymied.
Well, you know, most people know that we have not had an opportunity for any significant climate-related legislation at the federal level now for many years. So action has really shifted to the states, where there have been successful efforts in many states to establish renewable energy policies that actually promote using wind and solar rather than, you know, helping to reduce our reliance on coal and oil. There have been places like California that have really set up precedent-setting climate laws to reduce emissions in California, which is a huge global economy in and of itself. So that is where we have, at the state level, been able to move forward on some carbon-reducing policies. So the thing that's very frustrating and infuriating about ALEC, again, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is that not only are they seeking to block progress on policies that have not yet been passed or promoted, but in fact, they are seeking to roll back the few successful policies we have been able to get. And so they're seeking to attack at the state level and roll back the renewable energy policies I described. And all of the, you know, most of the big oil companies and the big coal companies are part of ALEC. They're in leadership positions on the task force that sets energy policy. I mean, they're really just disgusting. Now, I should say that in all fairness, some of the big companies have begun to understand how duplicitous and deceptive ALEC is. And so a number of big companies like Google, for example, have actually pulled out of ALEC because of their climate policies. Right. And a few big oil companies are beginning to do the same. So ConocoPhillips has left, BP has just pulled out. And we're working right now to persuade Shell, whose own CEO has said, we don't align with skeptics, yet they are still part of ALEC, which is promoting climate science skepticism daily. Well, so we're seeking to get Shell to pull out of ALEC as well.
Finally, Nancy, where can our audience actually go through the dossiers themselves and see for themselves the language in these memos and how obvious, clear, and deliberate the deception has been?
So please check out the UCS website, which is ucsusa.org. The Deception Dossiers report is on our homepage. It's very prominent. You'll be able to see the report. You'll be able to see a summary of all the different dossiers. You'll be able to actually dig into the documents yourself if you want to see them. So that's all available online.
I had a wonderful time doing that myself, and of course, it made me angrier and angrier, and hopefully people can channel the anger against this deception in a constructive ways. Thank you so much for the work you've done, Nancy.
Thank you a lot for this interview.
Nancy Cole is the Director of Campaigns for Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Again, ucsusa.org is the website to get a hold of the climate deception dossiers. This is Uprising. After we come back, we will take a look at ADHD as part of our ongoing series on the science of health. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's the diagnosis that most parents dread. Your child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Today, increasing numbers of parents are facing the prospect of dealing with developmental diagnoses such as ADHD, administering drugs like Ritalin or Adderall, and whether or not they decide to medicate their kids, of helping them manage educational and social expectations. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that in 2003, 7.8% of 4 to 17-year-olds had been diagnosed with ADHD. 4 years later, it was 9.5%. In 2011, that number jumped to 11% of school-aged children. There is ongoing debate about what is behind these increasing rates and whether it's simply a matter of overdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, or the global push for academic performance. Joining me to help navigate that debate as part of our series on the science of health is Dr. Deborah Budding. She is a board-certified neuropsychologist who works with children, adolescents, and adults in the greater Los Angeles area. She's co-authored multiple publications emphasizing habit formation and non-conscious subcortical brain contributions to function. She's a supervising faculty member at Harbor UCLA's neuropsychology training program. Welcome to Uprising, Dr. Budding.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So let me just jump right into it. There is a school of thought, particularly as you go into the alternative health circles, that ADHD is entirely made up, that it's simply a disorder that doesn't exist, and it's all just society's expectations on kids that kids can't live up to. Is ADHD an actual disorder that needs treatment?
I would say most people who have been diagnosed with ADHD would absolutely say it's very real. Mm-hmm. But it is a culturally, to some degree, when somebody's diagnosed with it, it's culturally determined what what is a maladaptive behavior, for example. But it's absolutely real.
And so when you say it's a real disorder, what does that actually mean? Because, when you have cancer, you have cancer. When you're pregnant, you're pregnant. There are no two ways about it. But when we talk about neuropsychology, yes, it can be a little fluid.
It can, which I think is one of the things that makes it so difficult. One of the challenges we have in the mental health field is that the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that people use to make these diagnoses, is behavior-based. It's not directly linked to the brain. And so when you're dealing with a neurodevelopmental disorder, my colleagues and I who do, we're called theory and practice. We do trainings together. One of the things we talk about is the idea of if water is not coming out of a hose, is the problem at the end of the hose? You're looking at systems. Right. Okay, so there are lots of different ways that a behavior or a set of behaviors happen from a brain perspective and from a body perspective. And it's not like there's one thing that causes ADHD. It's a multi-determined diagnosis, and no two people really who are diagnosed with ADHD are exactly the same either. So it can be a cause of confusion, I think, for a number of parents. And also, ADHD is sort of a misnomer in a sense that Martha Denkla is a researcher who basically came up with the saying that it's really more of a disorder of intention. So it really should be called intention deficit disorder, because the real challenges of ADHD are a person's ability to form and then implement intentions and to interact with their environment in a way that's effective and can meet the demands of the environment.
So how do you explain the increasing rates of ADHD that we see? I cited a number of statistics, and by medical standards, these are huge jumps in diagnoses.
I think people come at this question from a lot of different directions. One is certainly there's a very strong genetic component to ADHD. For information about this, I'm a huge fan of science Twitter. So Kevin Mitchell he's at Wiring the Brain, very knowledgeable on genetics, and I recommend checking out his work for information on that. I would say, in my position, I don't see a lot of kids who don't have ADHD being misdiagnosed. Sometimes I see people who have a lot of comorbidity, which means multiple diagnoses. So you can have anxiety, and you can have ADHD, and you can have other things. I do think that there needs to be care and caution and a great deal of thoughtfulness when you make diagnoses. So
and you think that there is not as much care and caution these days, or is it hard to tell?
I don't know. It's hard to tell because so many different people can make a diagnosis of ADHD. So
right, it's not just one kind of doctor or
exactly,
one kind of
exactly, and there can be differences in training in terms of what people emphasize, etc.
Which is part of the problem, I think, and also part of the public confusion over this.
I agree. That's one reason why actually my colleagues and I are going to be doing some web-based programming on neurodevelopmental disorders and trying to help people understand them both from a neuropsychological and current neuroscience perspective, but also from a kind of a more neurodiverse view as well.
And what about the efficacy of drugs like Ritalin and Adderall for those who really struggle with the disorder? Are those drugs actually helpful?
Well, I mean, I don't prescribe, so I can't really say, but I have certainly in my practice and with people I know seen properly prescribed stimulant medications really be lifesavers for people. So I think.
And does it go the other way too?
The opposite of a lifesaver. I've never actually seen that, but I do think
we hear anecdotal evidence of kids who have been diagnosed with Ritalin and Adderall, etc., whose sort of personality gets deadened.
Yes, and that's not something that's not okay. That's not how it's supposed to work. So one of the reasons I like doing very comprehensive, very persnickety kinds of evaluations is to help people who do prescribe make useful choices and to make sure that, stimulant medications really only work for a percentage of people who are diagnosed with ADHD, and they can be very effective with certain kinds of disinhibition, right? But for example, inattentive ADHD or kind of sluggish cognitive tempo, that's a subset of ADHD that sometimes responds to stimulants, sometimes doesn't respond to stimulants. But when they work, they can work quite well and can make the difference for a student really, really struggling and doing fantastic.
So let me get real personal here, something I hadn't really intended on doing, but I think it really does matter to bring up, for example, a parent's perspective. My own son was diagnosed with ADHD, which I utterly don't believe, and I basically said to myself, I would do anything before I medicate him. That would be the last thing I do, and he's doing fine. You know what I mean? He needed to emotionally mature, and he's doing great. And I find the expert opinion that was given to diagnose him as being full of crap.
Well, I have to say,
but,
I see a lot of people who come into my office who supposedly have ADHD, and they leave understanding that they don't.
Wow.
So that attention isn't one thing. And I think that's something that gets lost. A lot of things can cause problems with attention. And sometimes, anxiety in particular can have a huge impact on attention.
So kids who are socially anxious about being in social situations.
Right.
Yeah.
And impulsivity is not all the same either. There's again, you can describe problems with attention being due to your sort of emotional system figuring out what in the environment is worthy of attention, okay? And so one of the jokes that we have is that ADHD is more that nothing is interesting enough to keep your attention, and it's sort of the oh shiny, right? But on anxiety side, everything kind of has an equal valence, and it becomes very difficult to determine what merits attention because everything is equally scary or equally concerning. And so that's a whole other kind of attention problem, and it's very real as well.
On the first that you mentioned, how much of or how much do you think our current model of education has to do with how children might be reacting in their environment and being diagnosed? Because if things aren't holding their attention, maybe the model of schooling itself is problematic. We know more and more these days that scientists are realizing kids need to get up and move. They need to move and move and move.
Yes.
Whereas in conventional schools, we sit them down at desks, and they, at least for large chunks of time, cannot move, and that can drive a kid crazy.
Yeah, well, it drives me crazy. Well, this sort of gets to my colleagues' basic approach is very sensory motor based. It's much more about sensory motor development and movement and the importance of movement to development. And so I'm a big fan of Daniel Wolpert's work, and he has usually when I'm giving talks to large audiences, I play a small clip of his The Real Reason for Brains, where he talks about why we have a brain. And his idea, and this is not just his idea, it's a lot of people's, is the idea that we have a brain so that we can voluntarily control movement. That if you don't need to move, you don't need to have a brain.
And this is part of sort of how our brains evolve.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
The idea is that our brains didn't necessarily evolve to rationalize and think and, design large buildings, but to move, to physically be able to move ourselves from one place to another?
Well, yes, because again, we're either doing something, or we're thinking about doing something, or we're regretting something we did, right? So everything that we do in life is really about doing things. And so thought is, one way of considering thought is that it's offline movement, and we're planning movement, we're learning from our experiences, okay? So when we're asking children to sit for long periods of time and engage with only one portion of themselves, I think that's asking a bit too much. And actually, one of the things I recommend for kids who have ADHD, and for kids who don't for that matter, is a tremendous amount of physical movement. And for kids who have ADHD, to have a period of very intensive aerobic exercise before beginning school is very helpful. And there's actually some schools in the area that have the potential for students to do that before they try to sit down.
Or even designing classrooms where you're
Yes.
not sitting in one place looking at a blackboard and or whiteboard on one end of the classroom.
Yes, and more engaged. I like those big bouncy balls. I like sitting on those. They're good for core development. Although some kids end up kicking them around the room. So.
Isn't managing or helping children manage societies and educational institutions' expectations of them, isn't it better for us to design our systems to help kids manage them without the use of drugs?
See, I don't really see it as either or, because for a lot of people, if one of the main issues for their particular ADHD presentation is disinhibition, that is very hard to manage without any kind of medicine at all. But it's also not magical pixie dust. I tell this to parents all the time. If your child or if you are somebody who will benefit from some kind of stimulant medication, you still have to learn to manage yourself. You still have to, it's also not an excuse. When I'm meeting with children and with teachers, sometimes I'll talk about the fact that I'm horrifically nearsighted. And I can't just decide not to wear my glasses when I'm driving my car, because if the police officer pulled me over, I can't say, "Officer, of course I couldn't see the stop sign, I'm nearsighted," right? He'd say, "Why aren't you wearing your glasses?"
Right.
So I really like to have people respect their neurologies, essentially.
Does this the line of inquiry about how our brains evolved to make us, to look at our movement to rather than be designed to help us think, does this have an implication on autism spectrum disorders as well? I know that that's an area that you work on as well.
And I wouldn't say it's an either or. I mean, I think thinking's important. I mean, I prefer to be able to think. I think most people do.
Some of us make our living through just thinking, sitting on a chair and thinking.
Exactly. But yes, this is also relevant for autism spectrum disorders, and I'm fairly passionate about autism spectrum disorders and about neurodiversity. And in this community as well, I don't like taking this disease approach to autism. At the same time, I think it disrespects people with disabilities to not acknowledge that there are differences that are disabling, although disability is contextual. So in certain circumstances, whether you are disabled or not, to some degree depends on what the environment is asking you to do and whether you're able to do it.
I think that what you just said is such a crucial issue that doesn't often come up when we think about these kinds of quote-unquote diseases.
Yes, yes. I tend to, with neurodevelopmental disorders, I tend not to take so much a disease approach, although certain diseases such as epilepsy, et cetera, do have psychiatric diagnoses that go along with them. But again, that's why with neurodevelopmental issues, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, and it does take a certain degree of subtlety. But I also think it also just takes basic respect and caring for people,
which we don't have enough of in our society. On that
Sadly.
note, I want to thank you so much for this very nuanced discussion of ADHD. Thank you so much, Dr. Deborah
My
Budding.
pleasure.
My guest is Dr. Deborah Budding. She is a board-certified neuropsychologist who works with children, adolescents, and adults in the greater Los Angeles area. And her website, where you can find out more about her work, is deborahbudding, that's with 2Ds.com. If you missed that, just check our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor and research intern. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.